Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Libya may be about to descend into civil war. That's the fear of many analysts as the US-backed plans for a change of government seem to be coming unstuck. The latest violence has seen an army general, Khalifa Haftar, accused of planning a coup, and fighters allied to him attacked a parliamentary building in Tripoli and launched an assault on Islamic factions in Benghazi. General Haftar denies initiating a coup, but has called for the suspension of parliament and accused Islamists of taking control of the country. In a recent interview, Haftar expressed admiration for Field Marshal al-Sisi in Egypt and said that he intends to crush the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood. Libya has never achieved a stable regime since the NATO-backed uprising that got rid of Gaddafi in 2011. So what chances are there now for Libya's Electoral Commission's plans for an election on the 25th of June? Will the rival militias respect the vote, and can the elections calm tensions? Or will there be a mimicking of recent elections in Iraq, where violence increased during the polling? Joining me in the studio to discuss these issues are Dr. Wafiq Mustafa, Chairman of the Conservative Arab Network, and Jason Pack, researcher in Libyan history at Cambridge University and co-author of Libya's Faustian Bargains, Breaking the Appeasement Cycle, a report mapping Libya's militias and their relationships with the central authorities. Joining us on the line is Mohammed Abdul Malik, a representative of the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood, and Rehab El Haj, president and co-founder of the New Libya Foundation. Welcome to you all, but before we start the discussion, let's take a look at this report.
Today's Libya resembles very little of the hopes and aspirations of the society which succeeded in toppling the 42-year-old reign of Muammar Gaddafi back in 2011. The transitional crisis which subsequently arose continues to threaten prospects for peace and stability in absence of an effective political authority. As Libyans prepare for the forthcoming elections, set to commence next month, chaos in Tripoli and other parts of the country casts a bleak shadow over the country's future. Despite Gaddafi's usurpation, the consequences of the NATO-led campaign that precipitated his fall have appeared longer-lasting and far more reaching than anticipated. The political field, now dominated by new political actors and militia groups, continues to erode the legitimacy of the state, the outcome of which has left Libya fragmented and dominated by warring factions and ideologies. Following the crackdown in Egypt, Libyan renegade general Khalifa Haftar announced his intention to cleanse Libya of the Muslim Brotherhood and other supposed Islamist radicals. He urged Libyan soldiers to support his campaign to allow the Judicial Council to form a crisis government that will oversee the next elections.
Following the refusal by the expired National Council to meet the people's demands, the High Council of the Armed Forces call on the High Judicial Council in charge to meet the army's demand for civil and political stability in Libya and ask them to form a High Council to rule the country.
In a country blessed by abundant oil resources, a military split could accelerate the scenario of a civil conflict, similar to that of Iraq. Indeed, such a scenario may thwart the remaining hopes and ambitions the country has left. What is evident, however, is the incapacity of the government to control the militias, who have thrived on the national political scene ever since the fall of Tripoli. Of course, oil will be a decisive factor in determining Libya's future, but with many still holding on to the ideals and values that form the narrative of the revolution, there will be some hope that the elections will allow for a new beginning. Hussein Kizvani, Islam Channel.
So, Jason, this is a difficult and complex period in Libya's history. What is it exactly that's occasioned this crisis now?
Well, we've been seeing a process over the last 3 or 4 months of a polarization of Libya's many militia groups and political factions into 2 camps, maybe 2.5 camps, but roughly put there's an Islamist camp and an anti-Islamist camp. These are not monetary or monolithic groups. Of course, the roughly put Islamist camp contains the Misratan militia, but also the Muslim Brotherhood and their Justice and Construction Party, as well as more extreme and jihadist elements in the east, such as Ansar Sharia. And in the anti-Islamist camp, you have the most powerful militia, the Zintani militia in the extreme west, as well as some liberal technocrats and the government. And then, of course, General Khalifa Haftar, who many people are making a big deal about. He's actually one of the weaker elements in this anti-Islamist group, and he doesn't have much support either in Libya or from outside actors. And therefore, it's incorrect to say that the country is on the verge of civil war, or even that what's happened is a coup. He may say he wants to be like Sisi in Egypt and take power, but that's not really in the cards because he doesn't have the ability to do so. He's only able to accomplish anything through his alliance with the Zintanis, who are quite strong in the West and in Tripoli, and with the Sa'iqa, the special forces run by Wanis Bouhamada inside Benghazi. So you need to think of this as a man who's trying to make a power play, but doesn't really have that much of his own independent charisma and support.
So, Wolfie, do you think that's true? Is that your picture?
Yes, I see Jason have really covered it very nicely with so many factions. The problem with Libya, it is the most vulnerable country in North Africa, and it's a huge landmass, and the sparse population, and people in Benghazi do not relate too much to people in Tripoli. And as well, there's no central government as such. That's why this half-military coup with General Khalifa. I know copycats is a problem in the Middle East and Arab world. They love to, Egyptian copied Tunisians, as you know. It succeeds to some extent. But Libya, it doesn't have a central power, doesn't have central forces. And actually, I don't know what's the state of the army, Saika, which crack troops, and others. And the Air Force, I heard as well, meddling in the middle. So I think it's a very confused situation in Libya.
Okay, let me bring in Rihab El-Haj now. You're on the ground there. What does it look like to you? Is it half a coup that's going to result in an election?
I definitely kind of agree with Wafiq and Jason's assessment. I'm in Tripoli, so our perspective is a little bit different than it is in the east of the country, where Haftar is enjoying a lot of support. But I would say that our major concern here is in civil society is that the democratic process is being disrespected, despite the fact that there are elections scheduled for June 25th, which is almost a month from now. Despite that, the General National Congress has been under regular attack, and there doesn't seem to be a very strong voice asking for these militias attacking the Congress to stop. In addition, though it's true that Haftar does not have a lot of support, if he continues to gain alliance under the mythical war against terrorism that's being marketed at the moment, he will command an army or a body big enough to have economic power, which is how these militias operate. They operate through kind of a threat of violence to gain funding. Now, if you join his group, you may be much more likely to get funding or get your salaries, and therefore he may eventually become a powerful group, perhaps more powerful than any of the other rival militias or groups, which puts him in a position to prevent the state from having a monopoly on power, because right now, between the different militias, they kind of balance each other out. But it looks like he's growing, and he's growing quickly. And if he could feed his group with money, then it would be a great concern.
So, Jason, you were saying he's a marginal figure, but I guess what Rihab is saying, okay, but half a coup may get him to be more powerful than he is at the moment.
I think she's hit the nail on the head, that as a figurehead linking together other groups which are joining him by the day and potentially using that power for the control of smuggling networks and things like this, he's going to get more supporters. Very interesting, when I said that there are 2.5 groups in Libya, I forgot to mention the half, which is the Federalists in the east, and Jadran, because his attempt, whether it was to break away or blackmail the central government, didn't really come off the way that he wanted it to. He might throw his hat in the ring and support Haftar, and we've seen that they're having some deals behind the scenes. And Rihab is exactly right that the more alliance partners he will gain, his movement will be more powerful. But I just don't think he's going to lead that movement. He may be the guy who Western media talks about, but there are going to be some Zintani militias like the Kaka and Sawa'iq in Tripoli who are more important for controlling the situation on the ground or closing the parliament or allowing the election to happen than him in particular. To go back to an important point Rihab has made, the tragedy here is that the constitutional process brought into being by the August 3rd, 2011 temporary constitutional declaration is, of course, being run roughshod over. And yes, there's an attempt, oh, let's do this amendment, oh, let's have elections on June 25th. But we all know that those are post facto attempts to cover up that no one is following the steps of that process. And what's needed is to get back to that constitutional drafting and to focus on Ali Tarhouni's role as head of the Constituent Assembly to draft the Constitution and get back to the rule of law.
So is what's happening here, Wafik, that in the process of getting rid of Gaddafi, we all know that arms poured into the country. They could never be taken away from the people that had them in the first place. It's been a massively divided polity ever since then. And what we're seeing is another addition, another go round the village pump of that mess.
I think it all boils down to trust. The trust is not there. That's why you're having so many factions. So you got to have a process of reconciliation if Libya to stay as one country. We have to remember one thing, that Libya was subjected to huge bombardment, and its forces were completely destroyed virtually. I don't remember, is it 12,000 airplane hits? Something like that, or flight. I think Libya is in a very difficult position. I think the General Khalifa, he probably looking a bit ahead for support from Cairo, from General Sisi, which he probably get, particularly the seamen in Egypt fighting terror or Islamic terror, at least the media doing it and the government. So I think he probably trying to jump in the bandwagon in the same way.
Is that how you read that, Rehab? Is the sort of, the kindly remarks about El Sisi a kind of bridge-building exercise to help smash up the Muslim Brotherhood on both sides of that border?
You mean the remarks by Haftar?
Yeah.
I think Haftar doesn't necessarily. I think they're two very different situations. I definitely think he's taking his moves from the Sisi playbook, and he's been inspired and probably encouraged to take his moves from that playbook. But he doesn't have the support of an army, which is a considerable number in the Egyptian population. They have army members in their family and their friends, so it's really a very large institution that trusts Sisi. But he doesn't enjoy that broad trust, and he doesn't enjoy that type of support here. So although I think if he ends up building an army, if he ends up building support, he'll be able to. But he came out on an interview yesterday, and he didn't even talk about the plan that he had for getting rid of extremists, and neither has he made any progress, or has he been able to move within Benghazi to get rid of the so-called terrorists. Instead, he took the opportunity to share his political positions and to talk about who was to do what inside political institutions and how things should go and when. And he kind of made his intention for kind of being a political player much more clear than any intention to rid the country of extremists or terrorists. And I think his lack of political experience or diplomatic experience is not going to allow him to win the kind of miraculous broad support that he needs in order to do anything that Sisi has accomplished in Egypt.
I mean, Jason, in a way, there is really no comparison because in Egypt, there's a Muslim Brotherhood which basically isn't a terrorist organisation. It's being called one for political purposes by the head of state, and isn't interested actually in fighting the government militarily. That isn't the case here.
Well, to connect what you've said with Rehab's point, in Libya you have a void of institutions, and this goes back not only to the Gaddafian legacy, but also to Italian colonialism and before. And therefore, there isn't an army, which could be a counterpoint or an institution to run the country. And it's important to then see that Haftar's claims to run something called the National Army are a joke. He's calling his militia group the National Army, and everyone knows it's yet another militia group and lacks the institutions to serve as an alternative force. Similarly, the same is true with the Muslim Brotherhood. From the time of Hassan al-Banna forward, Egypt has had an institution which was called the Muslim Brotherhood, but it ran schools and collected money and did various social functions, as well as morphing into a political party. Libya hasn't had that. Political parties, as well as these kind of institutions, were banned and forbidden under Gaddafi. And the Brotherhood was never particularly popular. So whether there are wherever there are a lack of institutions, you have people rapidly trying to run after and fill this void. What needs to happen is a grand bargain among the many stakeholders at the local level. For example, I see it really about Zintan and Misrata, and not about the Muslim Brotherhood or Hiftar. Hiftar is, of course, tapping into a popular discourse when he says, I'm going to crush the terrorists, this is a struggle with the jihadists, and the Brotherhood and Ansar Sharia are all the same. This is, of course, false. But when I was in Libya in October, you can ride in some taxi cabs and guys will tell you, you know, I want there to be a Sisi figure who's going to come and crush the Brotherhood. That plays to a certain emotional logic and has appeal to some people, but it doesn't reflect the reality.
Because we've got Mohammed Abdul Malik on the phone from the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood. When you're on the receiving end of this, Mohammed, how does it feel? How real is it? Is it hot air, or is there some more unpleasant intent behind this?
Well, the first point I want to add is that we cannot exclude what is happening in Libya from the overall scene that is happening in Egypt and in Tunisia and elsewhere in the region. It's part and parcel of what's happening. And I think that Haftar has connection that goes beyond the borders of Libya. And that is an important element that should be looked into. The point that it's between Misrata and Haftar, I don't think so, because Misrata and Zintan, I don't think so, because at Zintan, at the end of the day, they are all together. The whole tribe is less than 40,000 people, and for them to go against Misrata, that would be ridiculous, really. But they do have their own agendas, of course, and that might conflict with that of Misrata. The bringing in of the Muslim Brotherhood in the equation is simply for Haftar to say that, look, I am part of what's going on in Egypt. It's the same thing. Let's demonize the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's use them to gain more support for our cause. I think it's that sort of thing more than anything else. And I think Haftar is trying to gain control for the single-minded purpose of gaining control, nothing else. And he's just using what is there in his favor.
And what's your view of the proposed elections? Will they take place? And if they take place, will the result be seen as legitimate?
Yes, I think they will take place. It is one way out, and no one can argue against the elections if they could be able to do them. No one could argue against them once they're done. And I think they are a way out. And I think eventually we will have our elections. If Haftar is not able to gain control within the next week or two, then I think he will lose steam, and he will simply either leave the country or find a way out.
Okay. So, Wafiq, what do you think? Do you think the elections will take place, and do you think they have the capacity to kind of, if you like, cauterize the crisis?
I don't think so. I think it's not possible in such a divided country, and it will not be going to be binding to a lot of factions in Libya. And I want to say something about Muslim Brotherhood and Gaddafi himself. He considered himself Islamic leader in his own right. Yes. And another thing, I mean, he had the tent, he had the camels, the dress. He was converting heads of states to Islam in television. He have done his share. So that's why he didn't need the Muslim Brotherhood. He was his own Muslim Brotherhood banner. He was.
So that's gone now.
It's gone. Yeah. But the thing is, it's gone. But he left a huge vacuum, huge crate. How are you going to fill it? I think it's beyond the country capability as it stands.
So, Jason, on the elections.
I don't think that's fair to say that it's beyond Libyans' abilities to fill that vacuum. The Libyan people can be infinitely creative. They have very high human capital. We all know about the natural resources that they have to exploit and use if they would like to. I think the Libyan people can rise to a crisis and a challenge. I don't blame outsiders for ruining the situation, but bad choices of leadership. What the Libyan people have lacked is leadership that will connect the local level where a lot of things are still working today. You know, the only things that are functioning in Libya are local councils. They're building roads. They're keeping schools open, while the national level is totally broken. So what needs to happen, as I've written about fairly extensively, is a kind of decentralization whereby the national level is connected to the local level through a series of grand bargains. And the security arrangements that work in Tobruk are going to be different than the security arrangements that work in Misrata, but they all need to be tied into the national arrangements. And this can happen if Misrata and Zintan say, we don't want civil war, we want to sit down, we want to finally realize that we have more shared interests than that which divides us. And in that scenario, the Muslim Brotherhood needs a stake in the arrangements. Even the Federalists and the Amazigh, the Berber in the extreme west, they need to have a stake in what's going on. But everyone needs to have a grand bargain before the elections can succeed. If there's an attempt to run these elections on June 25th and there hasn't been a grand bargain between these factions, one, no one will go out and vote. As we saw in the Constituent Assembly elections, less than 15% of potentially eligible voters actually participated. But also, you won't have a body that has the legitimacy to actually run the country emerging from that. And that's what we see with the current GNC, that because there's no grand bargain, they can't rule the country.
Okay. Let me just bring Rihab in here. Rihab, do you think, I mean, that kind of political settlement isn't going to happen before the election? So,
no, it might.
So it doesn't seem to me that that's likely to really have to be a process that could deliver it. Do you think?
I think I think it could happen because it is a state of emergency. When you look at how quickly the events of the so-called Karama movement have been moving forward, you can tell that it's possible if there's sufficient will. I think Haftar is scaring people quite enough, and can get, particularly, you know, the stakeholders here, particularly Zintan and Misrata. And I actually believe Misrata has the biggest kind of militia body in the country, although they've been kind of sitting dormant as these events unfold. They do create kind of a threat for Haftar and his movement. Civil society has been, and as a matter of fact, I have a meeting in about 10 minutes with several civil society organizations to encourage people to vote before the close of registration for voting, which is the 29th, but moreover to educate themselves on who their candidates are. One thing that could lead to move this country forward are the way that militias have been getting their power is really through kind of a threat of violence and coercion in leadership. And through that way, under the barrel, essentially, they've been getting the money it takes to finance their operations and kind of hindering the development of the national army. So our strategy is to really focus on selecting brave, patriotic people with integrity who are willing to risk their lives, essentially, for this country in order to lead. Because no militiaman or army man is going to allow a person who makes decisions under the barrel of a gun to lead them, nor are they going to risk their life in the name of that type of leadership. So it does require very good leadership. It requires us to be able to demand what we want in people in leadership and to pick the right people. But beyond that, you do need to bring various parties together. But the people who can bring them together is national leadership at the end of the day. We have an event on Saturday called The Networker, and we're looking to actually bring together these different stakeholders to just talk about at least their perspective for 2 or 3 hours with stakeholders across the country. But do we expect to come out with a solution? Not necessarily, but we expect to start a dialogue. If the two parties aren't willing, particularly if Dan feels that they're kind of going in a direction of usurping power, that doesn't really create much incentive to enter into negotiations if Rasta or any other group doesn't have any power to leverage. And we don't want them to be in a position where they have to bare their muscles or flex their muscles right now. So Haftar needs to kind of experience a loss or some clear weaknesses right now before that negotiation is possible.
Okay, well, that's where we're going to have to leave it for this part of the programme. We're going to take a break, but when we come back, we'll be looking in more detail at the events that have taken place in Libya and the prospects for a peaceful settlement and for an effective set of elections. Do rejoin us after the break.